As we saw in part one, it took great faith for the Bible students to break free from the darkness brought on by centuries of false religious practices. Yet their challenges were far from over. Jesus directed his followers to make disciples of people of all the nations. Thus, a huge work lay ahead of the Bible students, and the time in which to do it would be limited. There would be many opposers. Their understanding of the Scriptures would continue to grow, and their faith would be refined. As we will see in part two, the Bible students were about to experience what it would really mean to let the light shine.
By 1922, the Bible students were making remarkable progress. This small group had voiced their determination to advertise the King and his kingdom to the very ends of the earth. To spread this good news, the Bible students adopted the Bible students broke ground on their own radio station, WBBR, New York City's first non-commercial radio station.
It was one excellent way of reaching a lot of people. We have brothers who are in the truth today, some old-timers, that their first contact with the kingdom message was on WBBR.
By the 1930s, the Bible students were using over 400 stations to broadcast their message on 6 continents. Another tool for broadcasting was the sound car.
It was a panel truck, and we had in there a transcription machine powered by an extra car battery, and we would usually drive the sound car outside of a village and then play a
off the porch, they'd get quite a message. 4.5 minutes.
Ma'am, I have something that I would really like for you to hear.
Later years would see the development of still more methods of advertising the kingdom. Placards and information marches.
Of all the different phases of the work, I think that was a highlight of my life. I loved it. You felt that you were in a big army. Lots behind you and in front of you. It was great. I always enjoy those information marches.
Regardless of the methods used, these Christians were determined to declare God's name and purpose to as many people as possible. For 50 years, this group of evangelizers referred to themselves simply as Bible students. But as their understanding of the Scriptures increased, it seemed a different name would be more appropriate.
We were always just called the Bible students, and Brother Russell kind of encouraged that. He said we didn't want to be known by any distinctive name, but just Bible students. And I appreciated his viewpoint on that. The trouble was that people began to call us Russellites and Rutherfordites. Not only that, but the term Christian itself became a misnomer. Many people said they were Christians and they didn't have any idea as to what a Christian meant.
Their identity would be considered at a 7-day convention held in Columbus, Ohio in 1931. Attendees received programs with the puzzling letters JW on the cover. Speaking on Isaiah 43:10, J.F. Rutherford presented a resolution.
We have great love for Brother Charles T. Russell, and we gladly acknowledge that the Lord used him and greatly blessed his work. Yet we cannot consent to be called by the name Russellites. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and the International Bible Students Association are merely names of corporations. We are servants of Jehovah God, commissioned to do a work in
responsibility on the brothers. Instead of focusing just on gathering the remaining ones of the anointed, now all of a sudden there's this massive task of getting the message out to others who would then join us and help us with the preaching work.
Jehovah's Witnesses would continue to find new ways to let their light shine. But one aspect of their message would not always be well received. Jehovah's Witnesses were proclaiming that the solution to the world's problems rests with God's government. On the other hand, the churches repeatedly voiced support for human governments. Jehovah's Witnesses felt a responsibility to make people aware of the position being taken by their religious leaders. In 1938, more than 10,000 people jammed into London's Royal Albert Hall to hear a pointed lecture by Joseph Rutherford, while millions more heard this stinging message by radio. Always outspoken, Rutherford invited his listeners to face the facts.
The dictator of the totalitarian rule of Germany has entered into an alliance with the Pope. The indisputable facts are that the Roman Catholic hierarchy has stooped wholly to political methods to gain control of the world.
Rutherford pointed to the Church's role in the rise of Adolf Hitler, its alliances with fascist regimes, and its push in many nations to make Catholicism the state religion. When World War II erupted in 1939, nearly every organized religion sent its members into the battle. French and American Catholics killed German and Italian Catholics. British and American Protestants killed German Protestants. Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to make it clear that they were no part of this controversy. The Watchtower of November 1st, 1939 reasoned, "How could a person who is devoted to God's kingdom favor one side or the other in a conflict between factions of the world?"
It defined what neutrality meant. We're not pacifists. Jehovah is not a pacifist, neither is his son Jesus Christ. And when it comes to being in support of some cause, we were 100% in support of the kingdom. And so we could not engage in any of the world's controversies or share in their war efforts.
This stand would lead to their persecution by dictatorships and democracies around the world.
This is something that is so fundamental to Jehovah's people. They are absolutely no part of the world. They must be strictly neutral when it comes to any conflict between the nations. There's no other people that are entirely neutral with regard to the world, but Jehovah's people are.
Professed Christians who were not neutral, some who even gave voice to the teachings of Adolf Hitler, were exposed by Jehovah's Witnesses. Their magazine, Consolation, drew attention to side-by-side comparisons of speeches aired in the United States by Catholic radio priest Charles Coughlin and those written by Hitler's chief propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. The wording was practically identical. Coughlin's Nazi loyalties were repeatedly uncovered in the pages of Consolation. But Coughlin didn't appreciate that sort of publicity. His supporters stormed New York's Madison Square Garden and ranted during a speech delivered by Rutherford entitled, "Government and Peace."
The Puritans fled from religious persecution in Europe and settled in New England with the hope that they might worship God free from religious and political interference.
Rutherford is speaking, and the Coughlinites start saying, "Heil Hitler, Viva Franco! Kill that damn Rutherford." And they started throwing things down on stage. Well, Brother Rutherford realized what was happening, and he said,
"Lord, today the Nazis and Catholics would like to break up this meeting, but by God's grace cannot do it."
If Coughlin's goal was to discourage Jehovah's Witnesses, then he failed utterly. The witnesses continued to denounce religious meddling in political affairs, and they took no sides in World War II. And soon, they would boldly proclaim a Bible prophecy that pointed to the outcome of that war. The year was 1941. Having taken the lead for 25 momentous years, J.F. Rutherford had become seriously ill and was about to make his final public appearance. On January 8, 1942, Joseph Rutherford died. At that time, 51 nations had restricted Jehovah's Witnesses. The Second World War was raging. Some felt that these events could lead directly into Armageddon. In spite of this, in 1942, Nathan H. Knorr, the one next appointed to take the lead among Jehovah's Witnesses, spoke at a convention about a Bible prophecy that indicated that significant events had to occur first.
This international war is not the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Before Armageddon comes, the scriptures show a peace must come.
There was no peace on the horizon, and yet we said, peace can it last?
Knorr centered attention on Revelation 17:8, which indicates that a figurative wild beast would come into existence would cease to exist, but then would come back to life. Knorr then drew his listeners' attention to the defunct League of Nations.
The League is in effect in a state of suspended animation and needs to be revived if it is ever to live again. It has gone into the abyss of inaction and ineffectiveness. It is not. Will the League remain in the pit? Again, the Word of God gives answer. The Association of Worldly Nations will rise again.
That association did rise again 3 years later as the United Nations.
They didn't know it was going to be called the United Nations, and we don't make that claim, but they knew it was coming out.
So that would indicate that there would be a time of peace after World War II.
When we went back as pioneers after that convention, we saw that we need to go down and study with the people, educate them in the scriptures, and introduce them to the organization.
And based largely upon their understanding of that Bible prophecy, in that very year, 1942, Jehovah's Witnesses made plans to expand their preaching work.
Rather than thinking of, we're going to stop this work, no, there was a field opening up, and there was a window of opportunity for us to give a tremendous witness. How long it would last, none of us knew.
1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15.
To prepare Jehovah's Witnesses for this new field of activity, Knorr and his staff designed the Watchtower Bible College of Gilead, which would train full-time ministers for missionary service.
That is in you, yet with meekness and fear.
They also conceived the course in theocratic ministry, which would equip individual ministers to share their beliefs.
Thank you, Brother Robinson. That was an excellent example.
They could speak from the heart. They could go to their Bibles, share these scriptures. So they would have that kind of training now to represent Jehovah in a much more powerful way.
This education did more than help witnesses to overcome fear of public speaking. It strengthened their congregations, and it prepared them to give a bold witness in an even greater setting.
Jehovah's Witnesses try to obey the government and the laws of the land in every aspect of life. But the one aspect of life that they realize that the governments cannot control is our worship of God. If the government says you cannot preach the message, it doesn't take much research in the Bible to see that the apostles had the same command given to them, and they gave very clear answers when they say we obey God as ruler rather than men.
Jesus had forewarned his disciples, "Men will deliver you up to local courts." While preaching from house to house, Newton Cantwell and his sons were arrested for conducting their ministry without the approval of the state. The witnesses challenged the conviction.
Not defiant, but simply peacefully saying, no, Jehovah has commanded us to do this, and we're not going to ask a human for permission to do that which Jehovah has commanded us to do.
After a 2-year battle, the court decided in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses. But just 2 weeks after the Cantwell decision, the United States Supreme Court would decide another case involving Jehovah's Witnesses and the national flag.
Although we respect totally the nation and what the flag represents, to make an act of devotion or worship to a flag is in the same category to us as worshiping an idol.
Thousands of witness school children were expelled because they would not salute. Among them, William and Lillian Gobitis. The witnesses challenged the expulsion in court.
Then when the time came for the trial, that was very frightening.
Raise your right hand, put your left hand on the Bible. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Bill was the first one to go on stand. They asked him, why don't you salute the flag? And he brought out Exodus 20.
Thou shalt not.
Then when it was my turn, they asked the same, and I said,
the Bible is clear at 1 John 5:21, where it says, little children, keep yourselves from idols.
Although the lower courts decided within days of the Gobitis decision, the Kingdom Hall in Kennebunk, Maine was torched. In Illinois, a mob attacked witnesses as they were preaching, turning over their cars and destroying their literature. In Winsboro, Texas, witness Oscar Pillars was attacked by a mob that was determined to make him salute the flag.
And this put great courage back into me. The marshal said, he is the most stubborn devil I've ever seen in my life. So I knew then that I had not compromised.
Some were tarred and feathered, others were run out of town, several were castrated, and this was not just from 1 or 2 communities, but literally from Maine to California, from Washington to Georgia.
In Opelika, Alabama, witness Thelma Jones and later her husband Roscoe were arrested and unjustly convicted of selling books without a license. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld their conviction 5-4.
The Supreme Court ruled that the state, in this case the city of Opelika, had the right to impose a fee and a permit for the so-called privilege of talking to one's neighbor.
Yet, in the defeat, there lay a glimmer of hope. Dissenting Justices Douglas, Murphy, and Black stated that the Jones case and the earlier Gobitis flag salute case were wrongly decided. Jehovah's Witnesses saw their opportunity. They forged ahead with a new flag salute case.
Well, Brother Covington, it looks like we're ready to go to trial.
West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. In the Barnett case, the court reversed itself, overturning the decision in Gobitis. The court ruled that the school board has no right to deny education to children were experiencing amazing growth. The School of Gilead was making an impact. In the first 10 years of its operation, over 2,000
He blesses their efforts, but it's God who makes it grow.
Worldwide, Jehovah's Witnesses were preaching in 143 countries. The work was expanding on every continent. The witnesses were growing, not just in number, but in understanding. Since the days of C.T. Russell, Jehovah's Witnesses had been using Bible translations accepted in the various lands in which they preached.
The kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of
But there were a number of problems. Antiquated language, the presence of spurious texts, and the fact that most translators had replaced the name of God, Jehovah, with titles such as Lord or God.
It's just as if you're reading a letter about a personal friend, someone you love, and their name's not in there. It just talks about the man or the person.
And so the need was seen to have a translation where the name Jehovah is mentioned everywhere where it used to be in the original writing.
In 1946, Jehovah's Witnesses began work on a new translation of the Bible. The Egyptian papyri, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other recent archaeological findings helped make possible the full restoration of God's name. The results of years of painstaking labor began to be revealed in 1950.
By Jehovah's undeserved kindness, I have the extreme pleasure of releasing to the International Theocracy's Increase Assembly of Jehovah's Witnesses the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures. The New World Translation is the first to render the divine name consistently from Matthew to Revelation 237 times.
Restoring God's name to places where it had been removed didn't always set well with the critics.
But you can't do that, said one of the critics. The committee, in its foreword of 29 pages, shows how it can be done on valid grounds, and it doesn't.
This was a group of spirit-begotten men under the influence, and not inspired, but under the influence of Holy Spirit, love, respect, and reverence for the author. And they gave us this translation. See? So when you study this, you feed on the mind of God.
After World War II, nations were beginning to recover economically, but not spiritually or morally. Jehovah's Witnesses took steps to make sure their conduct was in harmony with the standards set forth in the Bible. Since 1945, Jehovah's Witnesses have upheld the Bible's command to abstain from blood. In the 1950s, though many were adopting a more tolerant view of sex outside of marriage, Jehovah's Witnesses held that such conduct should be shunned.
And it was pointed out about that time that one could not be qualified to have a responsibility in the congregation if they hadn't a clean standing before God. Well, I remember some brothers were saying, oh, that'll never work, and we'll never have enough congregation overseers to do the job. But Brother Noah and the other responsible brothers determined that we were going to maintain Bible standards regardless of the consequences.
Since 1952, Jehovah's Witnesses have adhered to the Bible teaching that those who practice conduct condemned by God should be disfellowshipped. Then in 1973, although many considered the use of tobacco to be a personal choice, Jehovah's Witnesses rejected it outright as a form of drug abuse. They were willing to uphold these scriptural standards, even if it didn't win them any popularity.
Sure, you could relax the standard and you could perhaps attract a lot more people. But Jehovah's never been primarily interested in numbers, but he's interested in quality of his worshipers. Only 8 survived the flood. Shows you Jehovah's thinking on numbers.
We will stick with the scriptures. We'll never water it down. A little leaven ferments the whole lump. This is clean. And when people come to the Kingdom Hall, we want them to feel confident that this is clean. Not just physically, but most importantly, spiritually clean.
For years, organizational matters were largely in the hands of the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. But in the 1970s, a concerted effort was made to align the organization more closely with the pattern in the Bible.
And so if there was no number one in the first century among the apostles, why should there be a number one today? But the pattern of the first century is a collective direction of the organization.
This collective direction is given by a group of men who serve as the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses.
There's a wisdom in a multitude of counselors. When we all see it in agreement, we're very convinced this is the direction Jehovah wants us to go. You can't do that if you're alone.
This adjustment has enabled Jehovah's Witnesses to do their work more effectively. They are building houses of worship faster than ever before. They are publishing Bible literature in more than 500 languages. In either printed or electronic form. Jehovah's Witnesses are convinced that this system of things is deep into its last days. And the governing body is intent on reaching as many people as possible with the knowledge of God.
We want to continue to oversee and give impetus to the preaching work, because this has to be done before the end comes. Mark 13:10, in all the nations,
is real. Thus, with living faith and joyful hearts, Jehovah's Witnesses will continue to let the light shine.